I want to thank the Institute for inviting me. Thank you, Omer, for your very kind and warm introduction. I'm sorry for those of you who are still facing the sun, but the twilight time in Israel and Palestine is very short. That's the good news. And the sun will set very shortly, even in Jerusalem. So you won't suffer for too long, at least on that account. I can't promise you the same thing about my lecture. That will go on after the sun sets. If I'm a bit anxious, is to see the people sort of leaning on the sides. In 2006, I was the spokesperson for the Israeli Committee Against the Lebanon War. And I was interviewed by Channel 10 on a roof like this. They wanted to be able to capture the Katyusha missiles falling on Haifa and an interview with me at the same time. And I was sitting at the edge, and they started by asking me, do you consider yourself to be a traitor? And could you push back a little bit? So I hope that I won't irritate you to that point that you will feel the necessity to push back. So remain calm, whatever happens. There are two events that happened within a period of 60 or 70 years that I think encapsulate what I want to say tonight. Now, I would like to tell these two events in two ways. One is allowing myself to fly on the figments of my own imagination and inflate them a little bit with my imagination and be less factual, and return back to these events in my lecture with a more solid reconstruction of what happened. The first event is in 1839, when Lord Shaftesbury is invited to dine with his father-in-law, who was the British Foreign Minister at the time, Lord Palmerston, and later on the British Prime Minister. And they had a dinner, and my guess is that after doing what usually two British gentlemen do in the initial stages of such a meal, probably among other things, summing up how many foxes were shish kebabbed in the hunting season, they came back to the main issue. And the main issue was that Shaftesbury wanted to convince Palmerston to support the idea of a British project of allowing the Jews of Europe to settle in Palestine and create a Jewish homeland there. Now, Shaftesbury did it for a religious reason. I will come back to it later. He really believed that this was a Christian thing to do. Palmerston was less of a religious person and said, I guess, because we don't have the minutes of that meeting, all we have is an entry from Shaftesbury's diary. I think he said to him, I'm not interested in the divine scheme. Do you have any good political, strategic, or economic reasons why we should support the transfer of the Jews from Europe to Palestine and the creation of a Jewish homeland there? Mind you, it was 1839. And Shaftesbury produced, a few days later, a 30-page justification for this project, full of fabrication. One fabrication was that the Jews of Europe wanted to leave Europe in 1839 and go to Palestine. There's no evidence that in 1839 more than a handful of Jews even contemplated such an idea. Secondly, that the Jews of Europe were very rich, and that would enrich Palestine if they would take their treasures with them into Palestine. There was another fabrication for anyone who knows the socio-economic reality of Jews in Europe at the time. Thirdly, he claimed that the Jewish presence in Palestine would solidify the integrity of the Ottoman Empire, which was the main British interest in 1839. They didn't want the Ottoman Empire to collapse because they believed then there would be a war of all the powers interested in the dividing between them the spoils of the empire. So that's one event, and I'll come back to this. But it really, you can see how the Zionist project was invented by very important and high-profile British politicians and activists before it was endorsed by the Jewish activists of the Zionist movement about 40 years later. The second event, which I think is even more far-fetched, this is quite true what I told you. I mean, I just added a little bit of my imagination. Most of it is very well documented. What I really don't know is, and I'm dying to know, what exactly happened in a conversation between Lord Balfour and Jesus Christ in the end of October 1970. I visited the church where Lord Balfour is buried near Edinburgh. And that's why I got the idea that he had this conversation with Jesus Christ, because he writes, of course, that part of his reasons for supporting the Balfour Declaration is exactly that. I mean, the ideas of Palmerston, kind of a mixture of religious reason and imperial reasons, if you want to. But I have a bad feeling that in his conversation, which may have been one-sided with Jesus, as far as my sort of religious upbringing allows me to imagine, he was saying that you're probably quite bored wherever you are, and you want to return, and one indication that you can return is the return of the Jews to Palestine. I hope you all know this, right? And this may happen, but there is a certain urgency in this, because there are too many Jews coming from Eastern Europe to London. So let's hurry up a little bit, the divine scheme. And I think in between that, now we have better proof of this kind of anti-Semitic part in the Balfour support for the Jewish state, and Palmerston's sort of Christian ideas, Palmerston's imperial ideas, and Shaftesbury's religious ideas. In between this matrix, British policy towards Palestine was formulated in the 19th century. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is slice history, as I always do, which means I'm not going to have a perfect answer to the question I posed. And I'm not going to describe the whole reality, just part of it. But what I would like really to think together with you aloud is, what is the power of a long-lasting historical perceptions of attitude of policies of the generations that come after? I would try to describe layers of certain perceptions of Palestine from very early on in British minds, and claim that today these perceptions are necessarily behind British policy towards the question of Israel and Palestine. I don't think they are, by the way. But I think the perceptions, one can call them ideology, one can call them discourse, depends on your kind of scientific upbringing, are so powerful that sometimes you continue to pursue certain policies that do not endanger that ideology, even if you don't believe anymore in that ideology. And that is not only true for the British policy in Israel and Palestine, it's true for a lot of political actors in the international arena, because policy very rarely does to change anything fundamental. Policies are meant, in fact, to maintain a status quo, not to change a status quo. And the status quo can be also mental, it can be a fixation, it can be a certain attitude. And I would like to describe that British attitude to Palestine as something that evolves through a period of more than 700 or 800 years, and not just something that began on that conversation between Balfour and Jesus, if it ever took place or not. Maybe one day we'll find the document. I think it all began it all turned out quite sour for the Palestinians when the Christian world decided not to heed a kind of proposal that St. Augustine made about what pilgrimage is all about. Because if you look at the history of Palestine's relationship with the West in general, not just with Britain, you see that things began to be nasty when pilgrims begin to buy land. When a pilgrim buys land, he forgot about the pilgrimage, and he thinks more about ownership. And from a native perspective, this is never good news. And contrary to what you think, it did not begin with 1882 Zionist settlers. It was there all the time in Palestine. St. Augustine said, "The task is not to cross the sea, nor to undertake a lengthy pilgrimage. Both when we come to church and when we stay at home, let us earnestly call on God." We all wish that people would not have crossed the sea and did not take lengthy pilgrimage from a Palestinian perspective. But unfortunately, and I'm not sure if I'm right in condemning Empress Helena of the Byzantine Empire for that, but she's the one, as you know, she was searching very energetically for the remains of Jesus Christ. And she started a fashion in the very end of the 4th century, which continues until today, of pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which becomes a religious duty. Now, pilgrimage, including from the British Isle, took, of course, a very different meaning during the time of the Crusaders. They were not just pilgrims. They practiced one of the two basic elements of a formula that I think the Zionist movement would perfect when it comes to Palestine. And the two elements of this formula are the following. One, you decide who is not entitled from a religious point of view to be part of the Holy Land. And the second part is you decide who is entitled to be part of the Holy Land. The Crusaders, who were all in all quite negative people, started with who is not entitled, not with who is entitled. And their definition, call it ideological or not ideological, was one of exclusion. They excluded the local population as the people who do not have the right to be part of Palestine. Now, the fact that the Crusaders dealt with this issue of exclusion meant that they recognized that there was someone here. If you exclude the local native population, you also acknowledge their existence. So they practice through this exclusion this first element. I'm not saying that the Crusaders all came from the British Isle, but one of them, Robert the Monk, did. And that's how he phrased that element that I think would later be perfected by others. "Let the holy sepulchre of the Lord our Savior, which is possessed by unclean nations, especially incite you, and the holy places which are now treated with ignominy and irreverently polluted with their filthiness. Enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourself. This royal city, therefore, situated at the center of the world, is now held captive by his enemies, and is in subjugation to those who do not know God, to the worship of the heathens." 400 years later, the question of who is entitled to be in Palestine would be answered as well. We already know from the Crusader who is not entitled to be there. But the question of who is entitled to be there would be raised in the both exciting and disturbing time of the 16th and 17th century, when Christianity went through amazing theological, philosophical, and theoretical revolutions. And one of these revolutions produced a clear association, especially among Protestants, between the notions of the end of the millennium and the conversion of the Jews and their return to Palestine. Again, central figures in this movement came from the British Isles. People such as Thomas Brightman, for those who are interested in that period, who most scholars who wrote about him like to describe him as the father of the British doctrine of the restoration of the Jews. Now, can I use this as you showed? I may return it. When these notions of who was the right and who has not the right remain part of a theoretical religious abstraction or a philosophical debate, and even in kind of ecclesiastical vision, they don't necessarily are harmful. I mean, even if people have a vision of people coming back or returning and people are moving out, if this all remains within a kind of a realm of the visionaries, nobody is hurt. But when these heuristic kind of ideas are translated into actual policy programs, they can have devastating effects, especially in the case of Palestine, on the Palestinians. Modern day, maybe even postmodern day scholarship would call it, when these ideas become a discourse, something terrible can happen and something very good can happen. Discourse turns ideas into a language that has power behind it, the power to change, to transform, to dispossess or repossess, as the case may be. When there was and is the political will, the military power and the economic resources to take such a vision of all the Jews returning to Palestine and all the Palestinians getting out of Palestine, when the power to do it exists, then this is not a pedestrian history anymore. This becomes main avenue history, for which we have to think, even today in 2012, about the implications that it has to our lives in this place. Now, this translation of abstract ideas or divine schemes as part of real powerful policy became even clearer during the 19th century, when Britain played a major role in transforming, when people in Britain, I shouldn't say Britain as such, but when powerful people in Britain played a role in transforming theological contemplation and imperial grand designs into colonial realities on the ground in Palestine. In Britain, a new form of millenarianism was born that would have a devastating effect on the Palestinians in Palestine. The proponents of this apocalyptical vision formed a powerful theological and imperial movement that would facilitate eventually the Zionist project in Palestine. Not only by material means, by providing it with the ability to build a Zionist stronghold, if you want, in Palestine, but far more important and far less known, by convincing the early Zionists to gravitate towards Palestine and not any other territory if they really wish to redefine Judaism as a national movement. I think only now we have a clear picture of the role that these people played in convincing the Zionist movement that whatever they have in mind when it comes to nationalism or saving the Jews from the dire conditions in Europe, they should not give up the idea of Palestine because it fitted so well with the millenarists, Protestants, whose center was Britain. Not only Britain, but mainly in Britain. A simple history of ideas, therefore, can lead us directly from the fathers of this movement to the politicians with the power to change the life of the local people in Palestine. Foremost among them is someone I've already mentioned, Lord Shaftesbury, who campaigned actively from 1839 onwards for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, he was not a politician. He was much more, today we would call him, I don't know what, a pundit, an activist. But of course he had very good relationship with powerful politicians. And his arguments for a greater British presence in Palestine through the return of the Jews were both religious and strategic. Now, when you blend together religious ideas with strategy, it can never end in anything good. And I think there is a much more direct line from his kind of activism to the ultimate act of British perfidy, which is the Balfour, the unforgettable, to my mind, the inexcusable and unforgettable Balfour Declaration of 1917. What made his dreams, from a Palestinian perspective, his nightmares, if you want, possible in 1917 and were impossible in 1939, when he first sort of conceived these ideas, were of course, first and foremost, the fact that in 1917, Britain had already physically occupied Palestine. But historians always understand it, I think, that if you have an idea, a motivation, an impulse in 1839 that is implemented in 1917, you should not separate the two. You should lump them together as part of a similar strategy, ideology. It's a matter of circumstances and opportunities, not a matter of different motivation. So the motivation was there already before the emergence of the Zionist movement, to make Palestine a Jewish homeland at the expense of the local people. Now, of course, in 1917, as I said before, and we only discovered it lately, there was also a Balfour sense of urgency that the program should be hurried up because too many Jews were coming from Eastern Europe to London. Now, Shaftesbury was responsible for another formula which I think Balfour perfected in 1917. When the return of the Jews ceased to be a heuristic idea and was transformed into a colonial project, Shaftesbury said, it's not enough to broadcast the idea. You need to facilitate it and sustain it. The Jews themselves, he said, would never have the power or the means to do it without us. In the more modest beginning of the mid-19th century, this meant assisting the Jews to return to the Ottoman Palestinian provinces by founding an Anglican bishopric and a cathedral in Jerusalem. He connected every building and institute that Britain built in Jerusalem from 1839 onwards, not only to its original religious impulse to have religious presence in the Holy Land and the Holy City, which makes sense, but he saw all of them as agencies that would help the Jews to return and build a homeland in Palestine. This probably would not have materialized as a policy had he not been able to recruit his father-in-law, Britain's foreign minister, later Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston. In his diary of the 1st of August 1838, Shaftesbury wrote, "I've dined with Palmerston. After dinner, left alone with him. Propounded my schemes which seemed to strike his fancy. My schemes were the return of the Jews and building a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He asked questions and readily promised to consider it. How singular is the order of Providence, singular if estimated by man's ways. Palmerston has already been chosen by God to be an instrument of good to his ancient people and to do homage to their inheritance and to recognize their rights without believing their destiny. It seems he will yet do more. Though the motive be kind, it is not sound. I am forced to argue politically, financially, commercially." Remember, that's my imagination saying they told him, this whole story with Jesus coming back and the Jews, not for me. Do you have something more serious? So he said, I am forced to argue politically, financially, and commercially that the return of the Jews to Palestine, building a Jewish homeland, is good. He weeps not like his master over Jerusalem, no praise that now at last she may put on her beautiful garments. So he was not religious. As a first step, Shaftesbury persuaded Palmerston to appoint his fellow restorationist William Young as the first British vice consul in Jerusalem. He subsequently wrote in his diary, "What a wonderful event it is. The ancient city of the God is about to resume a place among the nations, and England is the first of the Gentile kingdoms that ceases to tread her down." A year later, in 1839, Shaftesbury wrote a 30-page article for the Quarterly Review entitled "State and Restoration of the Jews." In it, he predicted a new era for God's chosen people. He insisted, and I quote, "The Jews must be encouraged to return in yet greater numbers and become once more the husbandmen of Judea and Galilee. though admittedly a stiff-necked, dark-hearted people, and sunk in moral degradation and ignorance of the gospel, were not worthy of salvation, but were not only worthy of salvation, but also vital to Christianity's hope of salvation. Shaftesbury's gentle lobbying of Palmerston proved successful. For political reasons, as I mentioned 3 times, maybe it's too many times, and not for religious reasons, I don't know, I enjoy saying it again, Palmerston became an advocate of the Jewish restoration. Among other factors that came into play in his deliberation, he wrote, that is now Palmerston, he wrote, the view that the Jews could be useful, he said, the Jews could be useful in buttressing the collapsing Ottoman Empire, thus helping us to accomplish the key object of British foreign policy in the area. This is so absurd even in the terms of Palmerston time, that the Jews from Eastern Europe, from the shtetl, sitting instead of the Palestinians in Jaffa and Bet Se'an has anything to do with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Well, that's a problem for the Palestinians. I mean, people were allowed to build these amazing structures of argumentation that had no bearing whatsoever for the reality on the ground, but were enough to justify later on a very important act of dispossession and repossession. Palmerston wrote to the British ambassador in Constantinople in 1840 and informed him, and I will not say everything that he said, but he informed him of the new British policy. So the Ottomans already knew in 1840 that there's a new British policy, and the policy is to push the Jews into Palestine and create a Jewish state there. And this is part of the letter. There exists at the present time among the Jews dispersed over Europe a strong notion that the time is approaching when their nation is to return to Palestine. This is utterly not true. Utterly not true. It would be of, it's not part of the letter, it's my letter to you, okay, don't confuse, okay. I'm moving quickly from 1840 to 2020. Now I'm going back to the letter. It would be of manifest importance to the Sultan to encourage the Jews to return and to settle in Palestine, because the wealth which they would bring with them would increase the resources of the Sultan's dominions. And the Jewish people, returning under sanction and protection and at the invitation of the Sultan, would be a check upon any future evil designs of Muhammad Ali and his successor. Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was challenging the Sultan at the time. I have to instruct Your Excellency strongly to recommend the Turkish government to hold out every just encouragement to the Jews of Europe to return to Palestine. The Ottomans, by the way, did not heed these ideas. Especially later on when Herzl came and the Sultan asked him, I heard there's a lot of money involved in this, and Herzl gave him a check that had no cover in the bank account for it. And then the Sultan lost totally interest in this project. But up to then, he was still hopeful that maybe some money would come out of this. Days after Lord Palmerston sent this letter, a lead article appeared in the Times on the 17th of August 1840, called for a plan, and I quote, to plant the Jewish people in the land of their fathers, claiming such a plan was under serious political consideration and commending the efforts of Shaftesbury as the author of the plan, which it argued was practical and statesmanship-like. Lady Palmerston supported her husband's stance, that being a woman much wiser than a man. She also noted that the main allies for these ideas are quite loonies. So here's what she wrote in her diary. We have on our side the fanatical and religious elements, that is, for the project of building a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And you know what the following they have in this country. They are absolutely determined that Jerusalem and the whole of Palestine shall be reserved for the Jews to return to. This is their only longing to restore the Jews. Later on, she would be more critical about this program because of these allies, which you can read in Barbara Tuchman's book on this. Modern-day scholars with a more pro-Israeli kind of propensity do not agree with the thesis that I bring to. They claim that the whole deliberation of bringing back the Jews as part of the British imperial policy had to do much more with the process of evangelical identity construction. This was philo-Semitism, they said, not Zionism. And yet, the very same scholars who claim that do agree that Shaftesbury, and that's their quote from their work, was the leading proponent of Christian Zionism in the 19th century and the first politician of stature to attempt to prepare the way for Jews to establish a homeland in Palestine. Now, if the main thing that Shaftesbury, or the main legacy that Shaftesbury left for British policy was to create a homeland for the Jews in Palestine through the help of the very secular Palmerston, I don't think it has anything to do with philo-Semitism or evangelical collective construction of identity. I think it is Zionism, maybe under the guise of philo-Semitism. But what is much more important, that even if it had a more benign nature, if you want, than the real thing being when the Jews take over the idea of Zionism, it becomes far more serious, because they are much more energetic, and they are much more focused on the project. They don't have an empire to run. They have only one project to implement. Nonetheless, you needed this brick in the historical infrastructure for doing it. Now, I'm not saying that there were no churches and clergymen and British politicians who did not identify later on with the Palestinian native call for self-determination or would resist the colonization of Palestine. But I think that in a very general, and I admit rough way, but I hope accurate, that if you look at the balance of power, who had the clout in the corridors of power? The Christian Zionists of the last 150 or 200 years, or the pro-Palestinians? The balance tilts very clearly for the Christian Zionists, including the main image I have since I came to England a few years ago was Gordon Brown attending the annual conference of the British Labour, the Labour Friends of Israel. So I think there is a kind of a continuity there altogether, but I won't go too deeply into it because the Consul General is still here. Now, British Christian Zionism was closely linked to German piety. It's also important to explain that, because there was a collaboration between Protestants in Prussia and the Anglican Church in Britain, with making the return of the Jews and the building of a Jewish homeland in the mid-19th century an essential part of the imperial policy. You needed Prussia and Britain to collaborate on this. This brought the first actual colonization, the Templars movement, who came just 10 or 15 years before the early Zionists. The Templars whose buildings are still intact in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Jerusalem, because Israelis don't mind in maintaining German heritage. They don't do the same for Palestinian heritage, but German heritage is all right despite of everything that happened between Germany and Israel. Now, the Templars did not only precede the Zionist colonization, they also helped. They also facilitated the Zionist colonization in many ways, but it didn't help them to be in the good books of the Zionist movement. When everyone was ethnically cleansed in 1948, it included the Templars as well. So it was all in vain from a Templars point of view. Now, in the 1850s and the 1860s, the project becomes very acute and very intensive because of one person, the British consul in Jerusalem, James Finn. Now, James Finn is very known to Israeli historians. His work was translated into Hebrew, and he rests in the Zionist pantheon of heroes, whereas he lies, I don't know how to call it, the rogue gallery of the Palestinians, if this would be the right antithesis to a pantheon. Now, he detested, he was an Islamophobic already then. He was stationed in Jerusalem between 1845 to 1863, and it was him who really convinced back the Foreign Office in London to make the consulate in Jerusalem a major center of activity for drawing Jews from Europe to come and settle in Palestine and help them get the initial means, like the Israeli Ministry of Absorption today, in their early steps in the new land. Now, he already is a proto-Zionist because, unlike everyone I described before, he is doubly engaged in inviting the Jews in and contemplating taking the Arabs out. So he already fuses these two elements I was talking about, defining who has the right to be here and who hasn't the right to be here. I don't want to recommend my book, but I will. My book on the Husseinis describes how the Husseinis were trying to at least curb some of his activity. But he was very capable in inviting more and more British institutions to be part of that campaign, and at the same time also beginning to contemplate the idea that Jews need more than just a hostel to stay in. They need jobs, they need land in order to begin a permanent, as he called it, a permanent settlement in Palestine. Now, again, as I said about the clergymen, it is also true that not all the British consuls were like this. His successor, Consul Moore, was far more sympathetic to the native population. But again, I come to this idea of mine of the balance of power between the Christian Zionists of the day and the pro-Palestinian, if you want, of the day. And the balance still tilts very much in favor of the project of what Shaftesbury called in 1839 the restoration of the Jews in Palestine. Now, usually when you sort of sum up the legacy of Britain in any place, you are reminded of the film, The Life of Brian. And you say, what did the Romans ever do for us? And there is, of course, when Britain is so intensively involved in Palestine ever since 1839, there is an architectural, an infrastructural legacy, no doubt. But it's really interesting. The only people who are interested in it at this time are Israeli historians. They love it. There isn't one architectural legacy Britain left that they have not either destroyed or wrote about. Palestinians don't feel any wish to write about this legacy as yet. Because if this legacy eventually, in their narrative, also in my narrative, I must say, facilitated the dispossession of Palestinians from Palestine, somehow it seems an unnecessary luxury to dwell on the architectural beauties that Britain has left behind, or a railway system that works, or beautiful roads, or any other good contributions to the country's functioning. So I think it's very important to understand this lack of appetite on the Palestinian side. Now, I just want to comment towards the end that in the 1890s, we already have the beginning of a Palestinian realization. Only 50 years, it's not that long, of the possible connections between British policy, Christianity, if you want, biblical studies, and their fate in the land of Palestine. One such person was the Mufti of Jerusalem in the very end of the 19th century, Tahir al-Husseini. Now, he was so convinced that he is witnessing what he called the transformation of transient pilgrimage into permanent settlement with the help of the British Empire, that he was lobbying very hard in Istanbul to pass law against Jewish immigration, and wanted the empire to weaken its relationship with the British Empire, because he felt that this is going to be disastrous for the local Palestinians. Of course, he was not successful. It's easier to answer the question of British betrayal, if you want, during the First World War, when promises are made and not kept, and when a pledge is made to the Jewish people to turn Palestine into a Jewish homeland at the expense of the local people. But I think it's important to understand that this more blunt chapter in history rests on layers of attitudes, discourses, and perceptions that preceded it. And that's why it would be very difficult to uproot it. That's why I think I would like to describe to you today the roots of the tree, and not so much the branches and the leaves. Interestingly enough, contrary maybe to the way people looked at Palestinian politics and Palestinian reactions, while the rest of the Arab world was still somehow extending the honeymoon with Britain, despite what was felt among many Arab intellectuals was a betrayal of made to the Hashemites by giving them only Jordan and Iraq, and by giving Syria and Lebanon to the French, there was still a hope that some sort of collaboration beneficial to both sides would continue. Among the Palestinians, I think at the same period, something is breaking in the confidence that the British are not only the allies they promised to be, they're actually on the side of the colonizers and the dispossessors. I'm always reminded of someone who was such an Anglophile, and he wrote the harshest words on Britain, and this was George Antonius, the head of the educational department in the mandatory government, who wrote the famous book, The Arab Awakening. In 1930, he said, it would be Zionism no less than British colonialism that would ruin Palestine. And then he said, without Zionism, greedy French colonialism, and British opportunism, a liberal democratic nationalism could have had developed in the Arab world. Now, I don't know if he's right, and I don't know if he's wrong. What I'm trying to convey here is not a prophecy that was made right, but the sense of betrayal was that you were leading us on a path that I was willing to go. But when it came to Palestine and Zionism, you betrayed your own noble ideas. And I think that was something that Antonius himself recognizes back into the Crusaders' time. He also is one of the first to sort of see it in a much more wider historical perspective. What happened next in the last 2 minutes of my talk is more than perfidy. It is a collaboration with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Not its initiation, but contributing to its facilitation, directly and indirectly. I should say rather, directly and indirectly. Directly, the British contributed to the catastrophe of 1948 in 1936 by destroying the military capacity and the political competence of the Palestinian community to face a Zionist movement determined to de-Arabize Palestine. The British destroyed physically an elite of 30,000 to 4,000 people who were the nucleus of the rural elite of Palestine. That elite could have had made it much more difficult for the Zionist movement to cleanse rural Palestine in 1948, but it was gone in 1936. And it was destroyed as an act of revenge, vengeance, and retaliation. It was a collective punishment. Indirectly, in 1948, the British stood by when the other segment of the Palestinian society was destroyed, the urban elite, when Britain was still responsible for law and order. In April and the beginning of May 1948, Israel destroyed, or what would be Israel, destroyed the urban center of Palestine. They could have prevented that catastrophe. They had the power, they had the moral obligation, they had the legal obligation to do it. There was no international law yet, but according to the Mandate Charter and according to the United Nations resolution of November 1947, they were supposed to intervene when the urban centers of Palestine were destroyed. But they turned a blind eye, and in some cases even assisted this destruction. So after destroying themselves, the nucleus of the rural elite, they watched by when the Zionist forces destroyed the cultural elite. Now, even at best of time, given the Arab Ottoman nature of that elite, the internal dissents, the Palestinians were quite defenseless in 1948. But without these elites, they were even further disempowered. Now, The British policy at that time is really worth going back to eventually, because the way it was planned from above and the way that it was executed on the ground is not the cause for the Palestinian catastrophe, but without it, the Palestinian catastrophe would have never happened. Thank you.